I'll be honest, I'm much more into contemporary philosophy, like what living philosophers are actually working on today, rather than like ancient stuff. But you can't really talk about virtue ethics without talking about Aristotle. Everything that we have that sort of that is this contemporary stuff is based on Aristotle's framework to some extent. So we'll need to spend a little bit of time unpacking it. So let's get started. To start, it's important to understand how Aristotle viewed the world. And he had this view through what's called like a teleological lens. A telos is just like a goal or a purpose of something. And he thought that like everything sort of had this kind of this telos. I mean, he even thought that like that's why heavy objects fell to the ground, because they had an earth telos. And heavier objects sort of had, I guess, like more of it, and so they'd fall faster, which we now know isn't true, but this is just how he thought about the world, and his views were and continue to be hugely influential. So a nice clean example of this is something like a knife. What is the telos of a knife? What is its goal? What is its purpose? Well, a knife is there to cut stuff. And so what we can then kind of do is think about, okay, how would that telos then inform the qualities that a good or an excellent knife might have? Remember that word from the last video, arete, that's translated nowadays as virtue. It's really more broadly understood by Aristotle as an excellence. And so a knife could itself be virtuous, could be excellent. That's kind of a weird thing to say, but it's excellent because it achieves its end, its telos, well. So a virtuous knife would be, sharp and sturdy and things like that. And so that is how you end up identifying what virtues or excellences there are for a given thing. You look at its telos. Okay, well, what about us? What about humans? What's our telos? What sets us apart from a lot of other things? Because, plants, take on nutrition. Plants grow. I mean, we grow too, but, so do plants. We move around. Plants don't do that, but animals move around and stuff. What really separates us as things in the world is what Aristotle calls like a rational soul, this idea of like reasoning. This is something that we have in a very special capacity that like other animals don't seem to have. And so that is going to be our sort of our what makes us distinct, and then our function then, like what makes something a good human is this rational activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Does that sound familiar? That is eudaimonia. So what we end up with, once we identify sort of what sets us apart, this idea of rational activity, we can then identify eudaimonia as this sort of like state that, somebody who has these virtues will be in. And so virtues, now we can start to think about virtues in the modern sense of the word as, kindness or courageousness or whatever. And for Aristotle, it's not just enough that you do sort of the right thing, that you manifest this virtue. You need to manifest this virtue because you identify it as a virtue, and because you want to do this, not just because I don't want to get caught or something like this. You don't want to merely comply with what these virtues are. You want to, fulfill them. You want to genuinely manifest them. And what's cool is, and this is something that we'll still see even today in modern debates, even in my field in epistemology, is, yeah, there are moral virtues like courage and generosity, but there are intellectual virtues. We've talked about phronesis, this idea of practical wisdom. There's also Sophia, theoretical wisdom. Sophia is half of the word philosophy, philia, Sophia. And these intellectual virtues are developed through, learning and experience. The moral virtues are acquired through, habit, through practice. So you have to develop these things. This is a really, really cool idea, and it's going to come around and later on when we talk about Julia Annis and her approach to ethics and virtue ethics in particular. So this idea of ethics, it even comes from this Greek word ethos, which just literally translates to habit, right? This is sort of like, again, like these are habits that we build. These are traits that we sort of, develop over time. We don't just do things, right? Like we do things because we want to, right? And this, bringing all of this together is how you develop these virtues and not mere compliance with them, but like doing things because they're the right thing to do. Now, for Aristotle, and I guess like this is kind of like a general sort of ancient Greek kind of thing. They were sort of obsessed with balance and unity and order. So like this kind of view is not super surprising. Aristotle viewed the virtues, something like courageousness, as a middle ground between a deficiency like cowardice and an excess like rashness. So courage is this middle ground, right? So you can imagine maybe like, especially in Aristotle's time, right, a soldier, a hoplite soldier, holding a shield wall or whatever. And, he's moving forward with his, fellow soldiers in a nice, steady unit. It would be rash to like rush ahead and try and attack the enemy, right? That would be idiotic. And it would be cowardly to turn tail and run the other way, right? The courageous sort of thing to do, and the way that this soldier manifests courageousness is to stay in that shield wall and march along. Other kinds of virtues can also be identified as this middle ground. So generosity here is the middle ground between miserliness, like not wanting to give anybody, like Ebenezer Scrooge kind of situation, and prodigality, right? Like, just giving too much away. Honesty. You can understate, the way things are, which is in itself kind of a lie, right? Or you can be boastful, which is also not quite truthful. So honesty is that middle ground between these, this excess, this deficiency and this excess. And so that's how Aristotle went about sort of identifying what these virtues are. And now we can kind of, this gives us a decision procedure for identifying the virtues. Another cool thing, this mean, right, this doctrine of the mean, the middle ground between deficiency and excess, is relative to each of us, right? And Aristotle gives this example, a whole bunch of food, 10 pounds of food is definitely like too much for me, but for like an Olympic runner or something, it might not be enough, right? So it is relative to us. And so, even what counts as courageous for a hardened, grizzled veteran soldier is going to be different for what counts as courageous for a new recruit. They haven't manifested those virtues yet. And so they're on their way there. And this kind of makes sense too, right? If a grizzled veteran turned tail and run, like that's like way more like, what's wrong with you than if a new recruit did the same thing, right? Some cases seem a little bit more blameworthy. Virtue is also very context sensitive. This is not Aristotle's example, this is mine. But let's suppose we've got two kind of cases of somebody needing to borrow money. So you've got a friend, they lost their job and they just need to borrow some money to make ends meet until their new job starts. So like, okay, the kind maybe thing to do there is to let them borrow the money. But if your drug addict cousin comes to you and asks for money and like isn't saying why and is being super shady about it, the kind act there is not to give them the money, right? It might be that what they need for kindness is, closer to tough love or some, kind of being firm or like, hey, we need to get it together here. So the same virtue can manifest in completely different ways depending on the context, depending on the individual. And so that gives virtue ethics a lot of freedom to be able to accommodate different categories of actions. Now, the sort of the guiding overseer of all of this is phronesis, that practical wisdom. You cannot have a virtue without phronesis. And this is because, again, like genuine virtue requires you to act from that virtue, to recognize what the virtue is and to do it because it is virtuous. And so if I, do something very courageous, but I have like no idea what I'm doing, that could end up being just rash, right? Running into a battle without fully realizing what's going on, that's just rash. But if I have a good understanding and I'm Achilles and I'm great with a spear or whatever, that is now courageous because I've got the phronesis sort of to back it up. And again, this is developed through experience. And it's why Aristotle thought that you really shouldn't start to learn ethics until you're in your 30s. Because you just wouldn't have enough phronesis by that point. And props to Aristotle or whatever, I think we're probably fine, given, how connected to the world we are. And so, you guys may be on the younger side of things and not quite 30 yet, but I think you'll be fine. Especially with some of the stuff you may have seen online and wherever. So, all of this is leading to this idea of eudaimonia. This is not just it's often translated as happiness, but happiness is like a fleeting sort of thing. You can be happy one day and sad the next. Eudaimonia is much more of just this activity of the soul. It's an ongoing thing that happens as you exercise or manifest these virtues. Now, it is going to be circumstantial, right? You cannot really flourish if you're super poor or super sick or have, really rocky relationships with people. These kinds of things can affect your capacity for eudaimonia. So it is circumstantial in that sense, but it's not just it's not a state that you've reached. It's not so much, an end goal. It is an ongoing activity. It's something that we kind of continue to practice. And this is an important thing to keep in mind as we start to move on to contemporary theories. But that's going to do it for Aristotle. So again, the big idea here, we need phronesis. We need this practical wisdom. Morality is developed over time. This is a really, really big idea. And when we manifest the virtues through this activity of the soul, that's what eudaimonia is this ongoing development, ongoing practice. So we'll start on the next one to look at this modern kind of revival of virtue ethics and the problems that we start to see within the contemporary literature. I'll see you then.